Tonight, we will have the pleasure of hearing from Carrie Dedon, Seattle Art Museum's Assistant Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art. Carrie came to the museum in 2013, returning to her hometown of Seattle from Boston, where she worked at the MIT List Visual Arts Center and received her master's in art history from Boston University. During her time at SAM, she started with exhibitions of photography like Go Tell It, Civil Rights, and Danny Lyon, Dissenter in His Own Country, and has assisted with exhibitions like Pop Departures, Martha Rosler, Below the Surface, Jeffrey Gibson, Like a Hammer, Figuring History, and most recently, Aaron Fowler, Into Existence. Tonight, Carrie will discuss her preparation for the upcoming exhibition, Imogen Cunningham, a retrospective, which will open in the fall. This exhibition is organized by the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles. We'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, Arts Fund, and major sponsor, the National Endowment for the Arts, with generous support from the Herman and Faye Sarkowski Endowment and the Marion Dean Thornton Endowment Fund. And now, please help me in welcoming silently but abundantly, Carrie Dedon.
Thank you so much, Pam, for that introduction, and thank you all for joining us today for this talk. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart as I've been conducting research for the Imogen Cunningham Retrospective that will come to SAM this fall, and as a native Seattleite myself. And before we begin, I just want to thank great numbers of you, really shocking number, are here tonight a year into our virtual programming efforts. Thank you for sticking with us, and thanks to my colleagues behind the scene for always supporting these great programs. I'll share my screen so you can look at some images instead of just me, and we'll get started. All right, I hope those show up for everyone. Okay, good. Imogen Cunningham is a seminal figure in the history of photography, a constant innovator on the cutting edge always of conversations in photography, and deeply influential to generations of other artists working in photography or otherwise in many other mediums. She also had an incredibly long career from the early 1900s until her death in 1976. She really did not slow down. And she was probably best known for, within that large body of work that she created, for modernist style. Let's see, there we go. For the modernist style that she began developing after moving to California. This can be defined loosely by these crisply defined images, a close focus zoomed in on the subject, and an emphasis on clarity, precision, and geometric forms within these natural objects, especially well known for these botanical images, an example of which you see here in Magnolia Blossom, which is part of SAM's own collection. You will see all of that and more in the exhibition at SAM this fall, but today we're going a little earlier. Before she became a towering figure in art history, looking at Imogen as a daughter of the Pacific Northwest. She began her life, her studies, and her career in Seattle and its environs, developing a distinct artistic style that culminated artistically and in terms of her time here in the Northwest on Mount Rainier in the series that we will get to at the very end of the talk. Born in 1883 in Portland, Oregon, Imogen was the daughter of Isaac Burns Cunningham and Elizabeth Johnson Cunningham. And you see photographs of both from later in her life and in their lives on the screen here. Both were widowed with 4 children between them when they married, and Imogen was the first of 6 children that they would have together. So a big family, a full house, and by all accounts, Imogen, who Isaac named after Shakespeare's headstrong, independent character in the play Cymbeline, was her father's favorite. We all know parents aren't supposed to have favorites, but sometimes they do, and by all accounts, Imogen was Isaac's. Isaac was an ardent student of theosophy, a movement popular in the late 19th century based on the belief of God as transcendent, the idea that knowledge of God can be found through spiritual ecstasy and can reveal the mysteries of nature, and in the principles of universal brotherhood and sisterhood, I would add, and I think so would Isaac. His beliefs and his encouragement had a profound influence on Imogen in her life, and you can see kind of how she envisions both of her parents in these portraits. On the right, her mother pictured very much as the sort of stoic, hardworking housewife holding the milk pail, going about her daily chores. And her father on the left, as almost a St. Francis type, the sort of hermit scholar sitting on this pile of logs, which as a sidebar, he had apparently chopped entirely himself immediately before this photo was taken at the age of 90. So this scholarly approach led him in June 1887 to move his growing family to the Puget Sound Cooperative Colony in Port Angeles, becoming one of the first participants of this experimental utopian colony. You can see early photographs from the very early days of the colony here on your screen. The charter for the colony, which had been written only about a month before the family moved there, advocated for women's suffrage, many, many years before that became a reality, and equal employment, pay, and education for all, rallying cries we can still all get behind. While living there, Imogen attended the state's first kindergarten at age 4, and you can see on the image of the right, the schoolhouse located right in the middle there that she might have attended. And the family spent several years there, but despite its utopian ideas, the colony grew way too quickly to supply sufficient food and employment to everybody who lived there. It had over 400 residents by the fall, so within just a few months of being founded. So the family ultimately moved to Seattle in 1889. Imogen stopped attending formal school for a while after the move, but continued her unofficial studies under her father. She attended the spiritualist and theosophical meetings with Isaac, especially when British women's rights activist Annie Besant was speaking, again 30 years before women's suffrage in the United States. And meanwhile, Isaac kept his children from more mainstream Christian teachings with the sweetest of bribes. Imogen remembered that he, quote, made taffy on Sundays so we'd stay home and not go to church. Isaac encouraged her reading and her early interest in art, largely inspired by the illustrations in his books, and encouraged her in taking painting lessons outside of school and in the summers. She shortly resumed her formal education and was one of the inaugural students at Seattle High School in Capitol Hill. This was later renamed Broadway High, and now just a remnant of this building remains as part of the Seattle Central Community College's Broadway Performance Hall on Capitol Hill. So you can see a remnant of this building left. There, her interest in art was further encouraged by her teachers on top of the kind of standard formal education that one would receive at the time. So the stage was set very early on for her by her upbringing, her education, and her father's encouragement for her to seek out an independent, career-driven path, something that was still very unusual for young women at that time. And around this time, she would have started seeing advertisements by the Eastman Kodak Company featuring Kodak Girl. As early as 1888, the Kodak Girl was used in marketing campaigns as an independent woman with a camera. Take a Kodak with you, say these advertisements that you see on the right, suggesting independence, freedom of movement, and an artistic lens on the world around you. All ideas that were very appealing to a young Imogen. At the same time, she was likely seeing ads that promoted photography home study courses. So in 1901, while she was still in high school, she paid $15 sent away for a 4x5-inch view camera and study guide from the American School of Art and Photography. $15 then, by the way, is about $500 today. So a pretty significant investment for a high school student who's already feeling very serious about this as a career and artistic path for her. Isaac, in what seems to be the only moment of discouragement in his life, asked why his daughter would want to work in such a, quote, dirty mess as photography. And indeed, photography was kind of a dirty mess at the time. A lot of chemicals hidden away in the dark of the darkroom. But he supported her nonetheless and helped build her first darkroom in the woodshed on the family property. Imogen describes this as really a watershed moment. She said, quote, I had strictly one idea, that of photography, after I started working with my camera. Now, the only surviving photo of this time shows the misty northwest landscape of her environment, rendered in the painterly style popular at the time, known as pictorialism. Pictorialism was a movement that emphasized the artistic qualities of photography, but often, important to note, the artistic qualities as compared against painting. Since the invention of the technology, the idea of justifying photography as an art form existed by using it to approximate the effects of other already established mediums like painting. Aesthetically, pictorialism was dominated by the kind of soft focus that you see here, color tinting, and often physical manipulations like composite images, or even going so far as to add physical brush strokes to the negative, really driving home that connection to painting. Popular subjects included staged mythological or biblical scenes and the kind of bucolic or romantic landscapes that luckily were abundant in the Northwest. And the emphasis on pictorialism was really about making pictures, not taking pictures, staging these scenes and constructing these images to look a certain way. Imogen would have seen examples of this style in the art and photography magazines that she subscribed to, and was especially influenced by the work of Gertrude Hasebier. Hasebier was a photographer based in New York, a woman photographer, 30 years older than Imogen, who had her own studio, her own commercial and artistic studio, which would have been a great source of inspiration and influence for the young Imogen. She would have seen this particular series of bucolic, biblically inspired images of motherhood in her copy of The Craftsman, a magazine that she subscribed to, and much later in her life would cite this image in particular, Blessed Art Thou Among Women, as particularly influential in her early development. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. Now, she graduated high school in 1903 and began attending UW, intent on continuing her study of photography. Now, at the time, as you can see, the UW campus looked a little different, not quite the built-up campus that we know now, and it did not offer any art or art history classes. So instead, she majored in chemistry, deciding to study the science behind photography. This merging of art and science began a lifelong interest and study in different technical innovations in photography. And it also got her a campus job, making lantern slides for the botany department, taking these microscopic details of plants. Hard to say for sure, but it's tempting to think that that experience, that early job, might have been in her mind as she was doing the botanical studies later in her life in California. While she was still in college, she bought a 5x7 camera and began making portraits of family and friends, very much in the style of Hasebier's images of motherhood and domesticity, always staging them in these domestic kind of sweet scenes. But she was also taking self-portraits, most notably this nude self-portrait on the campus of UW. This was pretty scandalous at the time. She herself remarked, quote, the Cunningham family was not easy with nudity. But really neither was the rest of the Seattle, I would wager. And in fact, you know, female nudes in art seem pretty run-of-the-mill to us looking back now from 2021. I'm sure we have a few in the galleries downstairs right now. But it was much less common in photography, which had its insistence on the real, is insistence that there was a real object in front of the camera, in this case, a real naked female real naked woman in front of the camera. Even much less so common, so brazenly taken in public, outdoors, outside of the controlled studio space, and even more shocking, taken by a woman. When we see nudes in art history up to this point, it's very common for male artists to use nude models as their kind of muse, but having a woman look at her own body in this way and document her own body in this way was really kind of outside of the norm. Now, Imogen was early enough in her career that this did not create waves of scandal. I don't know that many people saw this photograph even early on when it was taken, but this gives you an idea of the kind of groundbreaking, cutting edge thinking that she was approaching even early on, and we'll get back to that again a little later. She graduated from UW in 1907 and promptly joined the Seattle Fine Arts Society in 1908, which had been founded just 2 years before, in 1906. She was the youngest member and the only photographer, indicating the seriousness she had in her profession, and especially her seriousness in her profession as an art form. She wanted to work as an artist, not as a commercial photographer, an important distinction for her. And she wanted to learn more about the business of running a portrait studio with the intention of opening her own. So she sought an internship at Edward S. Curtis's studio. Now, Curtis was at the time himself working in the field on his body of work photographing Indigenous peoples across the country, but his Seattle studio was really the premier portrait studio in the city. So she sought out this internship, got the job over a male competitor who snidely remarked, "That little girl can't carry those frames," and she promptly got to work and showed that she could. So again, that rebelliousness of spirit kicking in and getting her tenaciously what she wanted. So in her internship at the Curtis studio, she learned all about the practical side of running a portrait studio with, again, the goal of opening her own in Seattle. First, she was off to Europe. Continuing her studies, she got a scholarship to travel to Dresden from her sorority to study photochemistry with a really noted photographer and chemist there. So she left Seattle in 1909 by way of London on her way to Dresden. Now I want to pause here and talk about this photograph, this self-portrait with Elgin marbles. As I'm sure many of you know, the Elgin marbles are sculptures and reliefs that were removed from the Parthenon in Athens and moved to the British Museum in London, and still very controversially installed there. They are an iconic symbol of Western art. If you look at art history in terms of the narrative that is a linear kind of canonical march through time, the narrative that was very much a la mode at the time, they mark a beginning. And here we have Imogen posing herself, 27 years old, holding a pencil and paper, very much in the tradition of artists posing themselves in self-portraits with symbols of their trade, as part of this legacy, as part of this story that starts at the beginning and comes all the way up to her in 1909. Really a remarkable statement by this young artist, and again, showing her seriousness about becoming an artist and a photographer. Now, on to Dresden and elsewhere in Germany and Europe, because she had great opportunity to travel while she was there. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the scenes that she photographed while in Europe are much more cosmopolitan than the woodsy landscapes of the Northwest. And while she was in Europe, she had the opportunity to go to museums, galleries, artist studios, the theater, the opera. She studied life drawing and composition classes. She experimented with platinum prints, the only woman in her labs, I'll note. And in a particularly watershed moment, she attended the International Photographic Exposition in Dresden, a slightly dry title for a major exhibition that showcased advances in photography in Europe and America, including many American photographers whose work she had already been familiar with, but maybe not seen in person, such as Case Beer, but also artists like you see on your screen here, Edward Steichen and Alfred Stieglitz, and many more. She was struck in particular by these American artists. and said, quote, "I saw the best of the American photography placed side by side with the foremost work of the European artists. And in technical skill, good taste, and real pictorial values, the Americans stood first." So she this incredible experience in Europe, but left really galvanized to come back to the US and start her career here. So on her way home, she stopped in New York to meet Casimir, who's apparently very sweet to her, and they had a lovely meeting, and to meet Stieglitz. Now, Alfred Stieglitz was already a giant in the field of photography. He ran Gallery 291 in New York that showed all of the great photographers of the time, including himself, it's worth noting, and raised the stature of photography as an art form. Imogen, for several years, had subscribed to his journal Camera Work, which published the highest quality photogravure prints, again, really seeking to elevate photography as a very serious art form. So Imogen went to meet the great man, went to his gallery, but was too intimidated and overwhelmed by his presence to actually introduce herself, and left without meeting him. So still a little humble as she starts the beginning of career, although important to note, she quickly kicked that when she returned to meet him in the 30s and ended up taking this really iconic photograph of Stieglitz, borrowing the giant's own camera to do it. So just kind of a fun aside there for later in her career. All right, back to Seattle. She returned to Seattle in September 1910 and opened her own portrait studio at 1117 Terry Avenue on First Hill. This was also her home, also her dark room. And she decorated it with photographs of her own work, especially from Europe, to kind of advertise herself to clients as they came in, and also advertise her services through the Seattle Fine Arts Society, which, as you'll remember, she was an early member of. She did quite well for herself and was celebrated in an article in the Seattle PI in 1913 titled "Successful Seattle Businesswoman." And in this article, in response to the question, "Is photography a feminine art?" she responded, "No, indeed. Photography is a matter of individuality, not of sex. A woman will not necessarily be better nor worse than a man." This was incidentally the same year that she published a really major essay titled "Photography as a Profession for Women," kind of a manifesto of how this could be a great career path for women in particular. That same article, "Successful Seattle Businesswoman," also described her studio. Quote, "Almost under a hill, high gabled roof extending not a great way above the level of the sidewalk, I found her little cottage, with the wealth of trees surrounding it, while climbing over it are beautiful vines, green even in the heart of winter. Green moss, too, was growing on the roof." Let me remind you, this is in the heart of First Hill. I looked up the address of that studio, and it's currently right next to Virginia Mason Hospital. So a very different scene in Seattle when she opened this studio. But nevertheless, she set up this lush space for staging portraits, both inside and having this kind of lush garden atmosphere outside, so she could stage outdoor portraits as well. And it attracted really a who's who of Seattle clients. Her very first client was the local writer Elizabeth William Champney, who you see on the left. And soon the Seattle elite came. They paid attention to Elizabeth Champney getting her photo taken, and they came in droves. For longtime members who've been paying attention, you might recognize the name of the figure on the right. If we were all gathered in person together, we would be having this conversation in the Plesjeff Auditorium at SAM. Her portraits were really celebrated for the dramatic use of natural lighting that she employed, but also for her adeptness at capturing individuality. This was something that she was really inspired by from Casimir, who had quoted saying that she wanted to take likenesses that are biographies. This is something that Imogen really held with her throughout her career, a long career as a portrait artist, and that you'll see again and again in future portraits. She was interestingly influenced in posing her clients in part by Japanese prints, especially those of Kitagawa Udamaro. Seattle at the time was deeply influenced by a wave of Japanisme, or kind of a fascination of all things in Japan. In fact, you might have noticed, I'll go back a couple of slides, in this image on the right of the appearance of a screen in her studio. She would have had a chance to see a lot of these prints that were collected by many Seattle Fine Arts Society members. And she specifically called out the work of Utamaro, saying, "Utamaro heads, I used to sit and study these things before someone came to my studio to be photographed." She liked his work because she was particularly interested in his use of reflections to make a kind of double portrait. And I'm showing you here a couple examples of that use of reflections from Sam's own collection. And that will come up again later in the work that we discuss. Another source of influence during this time was poetry and literature, and especially the romantic themes popular amongst pre-Raphaelite painters. Those of you who remember Sam's Victorian Radicals exhibition a couple years ago will recognize this painting and those kinds of romantic themes that come up in the pictorialist images. So a lot of overlap between the pre-Raphaelites and the pictorialists. And she often staged her friends and fellow artists, John Butler and Claire Shepard, as models in these kinds of staged scenes. Shepard, who you see on the left here, was especially a favorite model, in part because of her dramatic facial features, but also because she purported to possess psychic powers, something that would have been very appealing to Imogen and her theosophist background. One more image of Claire Shepard there in this very dramatically lit and staged photograph. Finally, she was deeply inspired by the landscape around her, often venturing into the woods around Seattle and on Vashon Island to photograph the landscape itself, as you see in this beautiful photo of the Duwamish. Or more often to photograph Claire Shepard and other models in nature, draped in these gauzy, romantic clothes, posing as nymphs or biblical or mythic figures. The misty environment of the Northwest, as we know and love it, really lent itself to that aesthetic of soft focus, that mysteriousness and mythical aesthetic that we associate with pictorialism. And of course, the theosophist idea that mysteries of nature could be known through the divine knowledge or spiritual ecstasy very much comes into play with this interest as well. Now, when we think about biblical and mythic figures in the history of Western art, often they're nude. Think about Birth of Venus emerging from her clamshell. And we've already seen Imogen posing herself nude in nature. But in 1910, she went a step further and hired a married couple with a child to pose for her. Now, there's an obvious biblical connection in Eve repentant on the right, Adam and Eve being ejected from the Garden of Eden. But in the image on the left, that connection's a little less clear and it starts to get a little murky. We see in this image titled Reflections, Imogen playing again with the idea of reflections that were inspired by the Utamaro heads. And in a way, harking back to the domestic scenes that she began her career with. Although we're outside now, we see very much the influence of Kazabir. But here, it's the father guiding the daughter to the water's edge, not the mother guiding the daughter, as we saw in that earlier work. Perhaps inspired by her own personal biography and her own connection and encouragement of her father. Most striking here, though, is that there is no biblical or mythic story alluded to here. This is just a family by the water's edge. And when these were reproduced in full-page images in the Christmas 2015 edition of the Town Crier, a weekly Seattle paper at the time, it was lambasted by the editor of another weekly titled The Argus, who wrote, quote, "If these pictures were posed in the open air, and there's suspicion that one of them was, the whole gang of moral perverts who participated in the orgy should be arrested." Strong words that caused kind of a local scandal and debate. But meanwhile, these images were exhibited in San Francisco and widely celebrated. So very much caused a local scandal, but really stayed in the local as her career started to take off elsewhere. Now you'll notice that the caption of these images, if you have good eyes and can read that small print, are a photograph by Imogen Cunningham Partridge. And indeed, around this time she met, or a couple years before, was introduced to her future husband, Roy Partridge, by the mutual friend Claire Shepard, her model. And they married in February 1915. Roy Partridge was a print artist, and you can see an image here on the right of an example of his work from Sam's collection. And they would often go out into the landscape together to sketch and photograph together. And shortly after they married, they went on one of these artistic trips to Mount Rainier. Cunningham, pregnant, carrying her tripod, camera, and glass plates, probably in a skirt because that was the style of the time, climbing Mount Rainier with her husband. And Roy posed for her in her most provocative series yet, On Mount Rainier, a series in which he's frolicking nude in the most dramatic vistas the Northwest has to offer. Now, she did title this work in particular Fawn, alluding to mythic connections, but the other works in the series are much more direct. Now, we have a few interesting things happening here. We have, we discussed earlier how a woman's gaze onto her own nude body was unusual in the history of art. Well, a woman's gaze onto a male nude, practically unheard of. We have focus getting a little sharper here, more divorced from that pictorialist haziness, to the point where in some of these images, Roy's features are clearly identifiable. This is not an abstracted everyman, but a specific man that she's photographing in the wilds of Mount Rainier. In many ways, this series represents a culmination of lessons learned thus far in her career in the Northwest. The converging influences of tomorrow with the reflections that we see really at play in the lakes and ponds on Mount Rainier. We have that pictorialist subject matter, bucolic nature, some mythic connections, although getting a little bit looser here. And the dramatic pull of the Northwest landscape, really first and foremost in these beautiful dramatic scenes. Also, we're thinking about the theosophist ideals of oneness with man, nature, and the divine really coming to head in these beautifully composed and crafted frames. And her gender bending ideas, she wouldn't say feminist, but we might, of the role of woman as the photographer and as the artist. In this case, really coming to culmination in these dramatic series of photographs. Now, I said at the beginning of this talk that this would be the culmination of her time in the Northwest, and indeed her time in the Northwest was rapidly drawing to a close when she took these photographs. Her son Griffith was born in December 1915, and after he was born, she largely worked in her portrait studio, no longer quite as able to take these roaming trips with her husband to sketch and photograph. Roy was often away on sketching trips, often very prolonged sketching trips. And she was pregnant with their twins in 1917 when Roy was in San Francisco on an extended trip when a series of fires, 3 fires, broke out in her home and studio and destroyed many of her negatives. This was really a breaking point. She felt that she could not manage her home career, his career, which she was still managing in Seattle, and the family alone. So against doctor's orders, she was about 8 months pregnant at the time, and against her husband's wishes, who wanted her to stay in Seattle, she quickly packed the house and got on a train to San Francisco, funded by her friend and patron, Carl Gould, who some of you might recognize that name, was the architect for the Asian Art Museum on Capitol Hill. Before she left, she destroyed most of her glass plate negatives because she deemed them just too heavy to carry. So the photographs that you see here and then some, I'm not showing you all of the work from this time period, but that's really what remains left of her work from this time period. This was a drastic and desperate move that was artistically reflected in the really dramatic shift in her work once she arrived in California. But luckily, she was so prolific that much of this early work survives, so we can trace this local history and the broader impact it had on her long career, and can trace what got her to this really important moment culminating on Mount Rainier in this series of photographs. That's the end of my local Girl Makes Good story. You'll be able to see many of these photographs and many, many more in the exhibition at SAM in the fall. But for now, I would love to take some of your questions. Stop sharing so Pam can join me on the screen.
Okay. Yay. Let's see. Hey, Carrie, thank you so much for taking us back through parts of the Northwest in a way that we would never have seen otherwise without Imogen there with her camera. She was a petite woman, so I saw her in San Francisco on occasion, and it was like this just, large appendage that was always with her. But anyway, we're going to get to some questions here. The one that comes up right away is, how many of her works in Sam's collection are readily visible on display? Are they rotated so others can be viewed?
Oh, great question. Currently, there is one work on view in the Minge exhibition in our Japanese art galleries. It's a photograph of Ruth Asawa and her young family, whose work that you'll also see in the Imogen Cunningham exhibition this fall. That's currently the only work in Sam's collection on view. But of course, there will be a lot more this fall, and they rotate in and out as the needs for the installations allow.
How large is the retrospective going to be? How many?
Yeah, good question. There's almost 190 works. Okay. It's a massive show. It's the first retrospective of her work in nearly 30 years, which for such a major figure in art history and photographic history is pretty remarkable. So we're excited to be hosting that.
Here's one saying, her portraits remind me of Julia Margaret Cameron's photographs. Was she inspired by them in any way, or could she have met her? Was Cameron's romantic style just back in vogue in the early 1900s?
Interesting question. I don't know of a specific connection to Cameron, although it wouldn't surprise me if she was familiar. Imogen was a voracious reader and subscribed to, as far as I can tell, every photographic and art magazine she could get her hands on out here in Seattle. I read that at one point she very sadly canceled her subscription to camera work because she just couldn't afford. She was on a budget in Europe and couldn't afford it anymore, but quickly re-upped as soon as she could. And it's really amazing how much she absorbed all the way out here in Seattle, which of course was so far removed from the heart of what was happening in New York and in Europe. And she really absorbed all of that through magazines. So assuming the work was reproduced in a magazine, she probably saw it if she could get her hands on it.
All right. Someone asked about their hiking. Would they have hiked into these settings on Mount Rainier to take the photographs? Would they have been alone?
Good question. I don't know. I would guess they would have been alone. Just for the boldness of, taking off their clothes and frolicking around and taking the photos. Yeah. I would guess that at the time that probably wasn't just a thing that people did in the company of others, but I don't actually know.
Can you recommend a good biography of Cunningham?
Oh, there's so many. Yes, so actually accompanying this exhibition is a really robust catalog by the Getty curator Paul Martineau, who's organizing it, including a fantastic essay specifically focusing on this time period by Susan Ahrens. So I highly recommend that. That's titled Imogen Cunningham, a Retrospective. I have it right here. And it will be available in the SAM shop if it's not already. I'm afraid I don't know whether it already is, but I can highly recommend that book. Otherwise, please reach out to the SAM shop too, and they'll direct you to some other great books. Another really fun one, if you're interested in reading some of this more archival history that I have sitting right here, is Imogen Cunningham Selected Texts, which is includes her own writing. Including that 1913 essay I mentioned, Photography as a Profession for Women, and a lot of other kind of fun remembrances. And I mean, she was a great writer and very vocal in her own right. So it's a nice way to let her speak for herself.
A little personal question. What caused her and her husband to get a divorce in 1934?
The support for each other's work.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it was rare at the time, right? And
yeah.
And she was fully, as you saw early on, since she was a child, committed to being an artist and a photographer, and being that and also a wife and mother was often at odds. And so they parted ways, let's say.
Did she remarry?
She never remarried, no.
Okay. What was her relationship with Curtis?
Yeah, so she did not actually work directly with Curtis because he was off in the field at the time, working on his body of work. But he had a really robust studio in Seattle that was run on his behalf by his employees. So it was probably the most famous portrait studio in Seattle at the time. So of course she wanted the best. So she sought an internship there and studied under his employees who worked there, but not directly with him.
We have someone who's asked a couple times about the style of the early work that is a little out of focus, almost impressionistic, and they're asking what you call that type of photography. Pictorialism? I think you meant pictorialism. Yeah. Can you just define pictorialism a bit?
Yeah, of course. So pictorialism is really defined by, you astutely noted, that sort of hazy, soft focus, by its subject matter in many cases, which are these mythic kind of biblical scenes, which you also see in the pre-Raphaelites and the Victorian painters. And really conceptually by its effort to distinguish photography as an art form in terms that we think of in painting terms, essentially. And if you think about the time period that pictorialism was really popular, impressionism was also a very popular art form. So that kind of impressionistic haziness you see playing out in pictorialism as well. And really, since photography's invention, there had been an effort to justify it as an art form, right? It's this young upstart, and what better way to do that than to say, look, it can do just what painting can do. There was a break in that with modernist photography, where artists were saying, look what photography can do that's different than painting. But at the time that pictorialism was really popular, it was really defined more in those terms. So you get that kind of painterly aesthetic, if you will.
Yeah. One person commented on the hands as being part of a portrait and having seen that in Stieglitz. And then, of course, most recently we saw it with Georgia OKeefe's presentation. Did Imogen ever meet Georgia?
I love that question. And you'd think that they were looking at each other and their work very closely because of those close botanicals, right? Yeah. They did meet. Both claimed not to be influenced by each other's work. And there isn't evidence that Imogen saw her paintings and vice versa. But of course, they were obviously familiar with each other. Imogen was obviously familiar with Georgia OKeefe's husband, Stieglitz, and likely vice versa. So it's hard to say how much direct influence by osmosis, that artistic style sort of happened versus two great artists developing an aesthetic in parallel, which of course happens all the time in history. So it's not unheard of. Yeah. And the observation about the hands is a really lovely one because that's something that comes up in a much more pronounced way later in her work. She did a series of musicians very close up on their hands playing their instruments. There's a beautiful portrait from the 60s, I want to say. I say portrait, but it's just of her hands, called Aiko's Hands, of Ruth Asawa's daughter's hands. And in Japanese prints as well, and in Utamaro, you see kind of a prevalence of hands holding these mirrors. So it's not unreasonable to think that that's something that she was thinking about early on, and it definitely remained a trend in her work.
Okay. There are a few questions about her photographic processes, like the gelatin silver prints, and then also how do you take a self-portrait using the camera of her time?
Yeah, so you set up the tripod and there's probably a shutter thing that's connected and that you can't see hidden in the grass there. It would have been quite a contraption that she had to set up. Certainly no easy feat. It's not like quickly throwing off her clothes and setting the timer. You know, she was posing there on the campus of UW for a little while, one would have to think. In terms of the photographic processes, I mean, she was experimenting throughout her career with everything she could get her hands on. I mentioned she studied especially platinum prints when she went to Dresden, and that was a large part of why she went to Dresden, to study different chemical processes. I can't speak with too much precision about the chemistry behind it. I'd have to call on our conservation colleagues to help me with that. But she was really interested in pushing herself on learning those technical processes. And again, that started with her education at UW, where she couldn't study photography in its own right, so she studied the science of it, and studied under the chemistry department. So it was an intrinsic part of her practice to experiment with these different chemical processes and different print styles.
One of our staff members has a question for you. Any interesting gems about the daily challenges of being a woman entrepreneur pre-suffrage?
Oh, interesting. I mean, I'm sure she could have told so many stories, and Pam, maybe she told you some stories when you were at her Mills College. But I think it really came out in how she advocated for herself tenaciously. That anecdote about her competitor saying that little girl can't carry those frames when she was trying to get a job, and she just did it. She just did the work. In some of these articles that you read, even as they're celebrating her success, you know, there's a gendered tone, like, oh, she has fiery red hair and is also a successful businesswoman. You know, we roll our eyes at that now, but nonetheless, she was written about as a successful businesswoman. And later in her career, especially when she was at Mills College, she really paid that forward and was very dedicated to mentoring young women in particular, and became kind of an unofficial advocate for women's rights and sex ed and anything that a young woman on campus needed. From what I understand, it was sort of understood that you could go to Imogen Cunningham and she would help. So she was a mentor and advocate. She never called herself a feminist, but she was actively involved in those efforts in her own way throughout her life.
Did she ever work in color?
She did a little bit. There are a couple color photographs in the retrospective that you'll see, but it's mostly black and white, and that was largely the style at the time. You know, kind of a classic modernist style. It was really just the stylistic mode that she worked in, a little bit in color.
Okay. How did the early photographs come to be in the Seattle Art Museum's collection?
Oh, wonderful question. I'd love to answer. Yeah, you might have noticed some of the credit lines are from John Hauberg, a local collector and very generous donor to Seattle Art Museum over the years, who kind of indirectly had a connection to Imogen because his father-in-law was Carl Gould, who, as I mentioned at the end of the talk, was the architect for the Asian Art Museum and also a longtime friend and patron of Imogen. So a lot of works came into through the collection that way early on.
Did any of her children become photographers?
Yes, actually, her children did become photographers. So the influence of mom working around them all the time, photographing them all the time, was not missed. And dad too. Dad was an artist too, right? It ran very much in the family.
And one has worked on a documentary about their mom.
Yes, her granddaughter made a documentary. Her granddaughter, Meg Partridge, who runs the Imogen Cunningham Trust out in Lopez Island, made a wonderful documentary about Imogen in her own words that will also be part of the exhibition.
Oh, it will be in the exhibition?
It will be in the exhibition, yeah.
Yeah, great. Did she know Ansel Adams?
Yes, she knew Ansel Adams very well. Together and with some other artists, they co-founded a group called F64 later during her time in California, which advocated for that more modernist photography that I was talking about at the beginning, the idea of something, photography with a very sharp, clear focus, looking at geometric abstracted forms, almost the opposite of pictorialism. She really had a dramatic shift when she arrived in California in this mode of working. And you can picture Ansel Adams with his very sharp, crisp landscapes as well, being a part of that. So together they and some other artists advocated for that art form.
Someone says he was surprised by the marketing of cameras and photography to women. Did Kodak have a special feminist leaning? Was photography not considered manly?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know that photography was considered particularly feminine at the time. There's been some interesting research done on how the Kodak girl was modeled after the Gibson girl, which was this 19th century kind of model of femininity that women, model Victorian femininity that was published in various women's magazines and that women aspired to. So as a advertising model, because it was an image that women were already had in mind and were already aspiring to, makes sense to me as a marketing campaign. I don't know that they were exclusively targeting women. I confess I have not looked at the ads targeting men. So it may well be that they were targeting both equally, but it was really the Kodak girl that was of such important influence and opened up a vision, really, for Imogen at a young age.
Someone says they see portraits of Morris Graves by her in the Sam catalog. Were they good friends?
They were good friends. They did not know they missed each other in Seattle. They knew each other later when Morris Graves moved to California. So there are portraits both early in his life and much later, which is nice. And portraits of other artists was really a trend for her as well. She artists in all mediums. So he was one of many close artist friends and associates who she took portraits of over the course of his life.
When did she become accepted as a great artist by movers and shakers in the art world? Was there resistance because of her sex?
I think it would depend who you ask to answer that question. I mean, she was included in exhibitions very early on. That those nudes of the family won awards in the exhibition in San Francisco at the same time as they were being lambasted in the press up here. So she was recognized fairly early on as a significant contributor. And yeah, I'd say throughout her career, she was pretty much recognized as such. Towards the end of her life, she was also recognized as a major persona. She was really an iconic figure in San Francisco, where she lived for the bulk of her life, walking around with her cape and her hat and her peace sign necklace. You could very easily identifiable, to the point where she appeared on Johnny Carson in the last year of her life. I mean, she became kind of a celebrity. That said, again, this is the first retrospective in 30 years. So she's due for a really serious examination as an artist.
Well, we'll be having it and seeing it all.
having it.
And what is the opening date?
The opening date is November 18th. I hope you'll
Wonderful.
all be able to come join us in person or virtually for more talks, whatever it looks like in November. We are very much looking forward to hosting that exhibition. And thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Yes, and thank you for answering as many questions as we could. There are still more coming in. So I hope this raises the expectation of this exhibition to come. Thank you, Carrie.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Sure, and thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. We hope you'll join us next month to hear from SAM's Anne M. Barwick, Curator of American Art, Teresa Papanikolaou. She'll be speaking about abstract expressionism, alternative histories, and expanded conversations, examining some of the artists who are often overlooked and operated on the margins of the abstract expressionism movement during the mid-20th century, discussed through a selection of works from SAM's collection. Please take a moment to fill out our post-talk survey and have a wonderful spring night out there. Thank you.